everyone, and welcome to the Changemakers podcast, where we chat with interesting and engaging individuals here and far about change, making change, living change in their own lives, how they've experienced unimaginable change, and innovative ways people uplift the lives of others. We chat about triumphs over tragedies, mindset matters, and how we live out our life's purpose inspirationally. So please join us to be inspired and empowered to be the change you want to see in this world. You know, we can all be change makers in our lives. Here's to the change you're about to bring forth. And to welcome my friend Avery Neal to our podcast today, and we are going to have an amazing conversation. This is a podcast where we create bold lives and careers by uplifting and supporting women professionals across the globe. So welcome today, Avery. We're so glad you're here with us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be a part of this.
So we want to give our listeners an opportunity to get to know you a little bit, Avery, and how you fit into the Changemaker scene as far as the work that you do. And so I would appreciate if you would share with us a little bit about your background and what makes your heart sing professionally.
Yes, so I am actually a psychotherapist, and I specialize in depression and anxiety in women. I love working with women, and have kind of devoted my career to doing so. I have worked extensively with women suffering from generalized depression and anxiety, to postpartum depression, to relationship difficulties, recovering from abuse, and my overall goal is to really help to empower women to go on and live their best lives. I have a real passion for women who have, people in general who have been in abusive relationships, and wrote a book a few years ago on subtly abusive relationships, the relationships that are unhealthy, and that sort of tear people down or make them feel bad about themselves, even when there's no overt abuse or any obvious markers of mistreatment.
So heartbreaking, I'm sure, isn't it?
Oh, it absolutely can be. Absolutely.
So share with us, what does that work look like, in real time, the work that you do with the women, and what is the work that you take these women through, which could be any of us, to help move them into a positive direction?
Sure. So it really varies depending on the individual, but generally speaking, I would say, looking at a person's past experiences, particularly if there's been any kind of trauma, and healing some of those older wounds that the person is still carrying with them, and learning how to take care of oneself moving forward. That's kind of the general idea. And, it depends on the individual. What we all need varies a bit. However, we also have quite a bit in common, and sometimes going through difficult experiences, we can feel a bit isolated and alone. And I think a lot of us are relieved to hear that that other people may share, and likely do share, similar experiences. So the way I work with women, I am in private practice, so I work with women individually, but I also write and have a blog, and excited. I'm just launching a new class or a new course on healthy relationships. So I think this information is important for women and all people to know, sort of what's healthy in relationships and what's not. And that's not something that's necessarily taught. So that's my goal.
Wonderful. So is it the course Healthy Love 101, your guide to healthy love and strong partnership?
Yes, that's it.
Oh gosh. Oh my gosh. Please tell us some more about that.
So it's a 10-week class or a 10-part course, and each course has about a 1 to 3 minute video, and then the written content associated with it. And each class has homework assignment, and I've tried to make um, the lessons as if someone is in a therapy session. So it's very immersive, very interactive. I give homework assignments so that even though we may not be in a therapy session together, my hope is that students will be able to connect with themselves and their journey as if we were together in therapy. So that's kind of the way it's structured, and my hope is that people are able to get more in touch with themselves and what they need moving forward.
Wow, that's so powerful.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for all that work that you bring to us, because there's not exactly a one definitive guide or book or lesson to teach us how to have healthy relationships.
That's it. That's the funny thing about relationships is, our relationships are such a huge, massive part of all of our lives. And, when something's off in one of our primary relationships, we feel it, we notice it, and it greatly impacts how we're doing. And so because we're not really taught what relationships should be like, and what's okay and what's not okay, and how to be a good partner and what you should expect in return and all of that, I find that that a lot of us are just either accepting mistreatment, thinking, oh, this is just the norm, or perhaps we are on the other end and maybe not being the partners that we need to be.
Yes. Well, there's just no getting around the fact that whether you're in the workplace or, you are not in the workplace, but you may work at home, you have children or you don't have children. I mean, when I was doing my undergraduate work, I did a lot of work in communication studies.
Mm-hmm.
For individuals, for problem solving, for conflict resolution, for groups, dynamics, organizations. And it was interesting to me then, it was fascinating to me then and interesting to me now that my entire career has centered around helping whatever audience of people to become more effective communicators.
Yeah.
And, because as relationships, I mean, clearly you can't have relationships without communicating, and you really cannot exist without communicating at all. Some of these most dynamic and all-encompassing skill sets, none of us were taught the proper way or healthy way to move
Yes.
forward in these massive areas that have countless impacts and implications in our daily lives.
Absolutely. It is so true. And to your point, a lot of times, working relationships in our working environment can be quite toxic. And then that, of course, then affects our relationships at home. It's an added major stressor in our lives. And, it's hard to be our best selves if we are certainly in any type of abusive situation, whether that's emotional abuse at work or at home.
Exactly. So I'm just curious, how do you, are there a couple of, off the suggestions or steps that people can take, which is a very broad reaching question.
Sure.
to just assess, to just maybe ask themselves one or two questions if there's a little rumbling inside of us that this doesn't feel quite right, whether it's a boss or a spouse or a, coworker relationship.
Sure, sure. So I always say that the number one thing to pay attention to is how you feel in a relationship or around someone, because certainly if it's a subtly abusive dynamic, it can be very hard to put your finger on it, and you may know that something's wrong, but you have no sort of tangible proof, for lack of a better term, and so then you start questioning yourself, doubting yourself, that type of thing. So I would say the number one thing is pay attention to how you feel around someone, or in a particular setting or in a particular relationship, because those feelings are there for a reason. They're telling you something, and it's important to pay attention to that so you can delve a little bit deeper and figure out, what's going on, and what steps you need to take from there.
Wonderful. We're so impressed with the breadth of the body of your work and how broadly you've been published, and International Association of Healthcare Professionals, and recognized, by your fellow psychologists across the country, published in Oprah, Best Self Magazine, Pop Sugar. Wow, that that is daily OM of so many things. So maybe from a woman business owner perspective, what are a couple of things that have helped you navigate your way to profession and achieving some of your growth goals of, obviously developing a tremendous reputation and personal brand for yourself?
Oh, well, thank you. Well, I would say, really, I mean, my path was one where I've always loved what I do. I've always loved working with women, and have considered it an honor to get to do what I do. And that sort of evolved into noticing, some patterns emerging that I would hear over and over. And so I began to write those things down. And as I wrote, I ended up with not any particular idea in mind, but I ended up with a book. And so one thing just kind of led to another, led to another, led to another. And that book ended up being If He's So Great, Why Do I Feel So Bad? And that's about recognizing and overcoming subtle abuse. And so it turns out that this is a subject that applies to so many of us. And in fact, over 50% of Americans have been in a psychologically abusive relationship in their lifetime at some point. And those are the people who report it. And those are the people who are talking about romantic relationships. So, we're not even getting into the workplace. So this is just an area that I think affects so many of us, as do depression and anxiety. So these are just areas that are of particular interest to me, since they do seem to affect women. And I think it's important to talk about, so that we can kind of help support one another through these challenges, and also kind of have a roadmap for how to effectively navigate them. So I don't know that I have any words of wisdom in terms of, oh, do this and you'll be successful, except for I would say that if you are passionate about something, if you believe in something, go for it, because then it's not going to feel like work. It's going to resonate with you. It like you say, it's going to make your heart sing, and I believe that you will be successful. So I guess those are my words of wisdom.
Well, thank you for that. One of the things that in all the work that I do with women professionals, and those are, we all are women, we all have some of the same issues. However, what I have found over 25 plus years in working with women in male dominated professions is that there's a little place of extra specialists You go into a workplace every day and your ideas are marginalized, and there is this implicit bias that really attacks the mind and the heart, because that population, they've taken extra steps in their educational journeys, to be degree and certified and leaders in their own right. Yet, what I have found is that, I think this is too strong a word, are really working in progressive environments. And so some of the professional services, legal services, financial services, they have some of the highest rates of substance abuse, depression, divorce, suicide. I mean, it's horrid, really. I mean,
Absolutely.
I only laugh because it sounds so ridiculous. Like, why would anybody do this? But I'm just curious, from your experience, do you see any contrast of your women patients depending on their professional choices, and how it may relate to some of these horrible situations or conditions impacting them?
Absolutely. This is a great thing to talk about. So I do work with, very high functioning women. Many of these women are very high powered career women, and there is a lot of stress that comes along with that. And whenever we're putting ourselves in a stressful situation for a prolonged period of time, it takes a toll. And that can manifest in various ways, depending on how we choose to cope with that stress. But for most of us, sort of our automatic reaction is to, or our automatic sort of feeling is to become sort of overwhelmed and to try to keep up with the pace. And then that can lead to becoming quite anxious. And then that also can turn to depression as well. And this is particularly the case because at the core of both of those things is really a sense of helplessness. When we feel powerless, when we feel stuck, if we're in an unhealthy environment for a long time, that can even be traumatic. And so when we have these feelings of powerlessness or helplessness for a long time, that can become very disabling. And so we turn to whatever we can to try to cope with that and cope with those feelings. And unfortunately, sometimes those coping mechanisms are unhealthy. And so I think it's really, really important to evaluate one's career and life overall to figure out, is there anything that's causing stress, the amount of stress or trauma, to put yourself in a position where you could get to that point where you're questioning your life, you're questioning your sanity, you're questioning your reality, you're not wanting to live your life or to get up in the morning. These are major red flags that something is wrong and that a change is necessary. Did I lose you?
Can you hear me?
Okay, now I can hear you.
Gotcha.
Could you hear me?
Yes,
you hear me?
Yes, we're fine.
Okay.
So I was just going to say, I've seen it way too many times that the workplace, it ends up having a tremendously negative, depressive effect on, I'm just going to say, high achieving, high powered women.
Yeah.
And and that sense of hopelessness that comes from that emanates from that. However, in the work I've done with these women, they feel like they don't have a way out, that they're trapped.
Yes.
And one of the things that, I'm not a psychotherapist. I've worked with psychotherapists in my work with these women in various capacities, in training programs. But for our listeners, I would love for you to contrast, if you could, what does stress look like compared to what does trauma? If probably don't even realize that they're being traumatized in some of these, in some of these workplace situations.
Sure, sure. And absolutely, a lot of times we think of trauma as like a particularly traumatic event that happens, and it's life-threatening, and, we may develop post-traumatic stress as a result. But trauma can actually be less acute and just chronic. And over that long period of time, we basically do our best to adjust to our conditions, but it doesn't mean that we're thriving. And so, particularly if it's causing us to uh, kind of develop some of these unhealthy patterns, whether they're just our internal thought process, or whether it's actually destructive coping behaviors. A lot of times we're not even realizing the effect that a particularly stressful situation is having on us. We just know that we don't like it. But it is important to pay attention to how stressful it is and how much we're offsetting that stress with positive things in our lives. Because we can get through stress short term, if we kind of take care of ourselves after the fact and recover from it. But a lot of us find ourselves in a situation where we are actually in this stressful state for a really, really prolonged period of time, and we're not giving ourselves the space to recover from it. And to your point, we may not feel like there's an alternative, but there are ways, even if you can't necessarily change your situation, your external situation immediately, there are things that you can do sort of internally to help yourself get through that stress that are healthy and not destructive.
Yes, yes. And thank you for that. And so let's, given the name of our company and our podcast, Changemakers, let's talk about change making for a moment, because we all are in a constant state of change, hopefully, change being growth and forward movement. And I'm curious, what is this like in your world and in the work that you do with your patients?
Sure. Well, change is occurring all of the time. In fact, I even read a quote the other day somewhere that said, "The only thing certain in life is that there's change."
Correct.
So yes, that's inevitable. And so, change can be and often is just a wonderful thing, and especially when it's in a positive direction. And so I'm fortunate enough to get to witness this really on a daily basis, where people are able to sort of develop awareness around themselves and their experiences, and they truly get to decide what they want to change in their lives. What's not, they get to evaluate what's not working, and they can evaluate and think about what they want to grow in their lives and what they want to nurture, so that begins to take up and have a bigger presence in their lives. And so that's something that is really one of the most remarkable things I think about the human experience is this ability to grow and evolve in really sort of almost any direction we choose.
Right. Well, one of the things that I've long been very aware of um, is many people's resistance to change,
Yes.
because we're creatures of habit,
Yes.
and we like to do the same thing. That's not to say to the exclusion of everything else. But I purposely named the company and the podcast Changemakers because I believe in growth constantly, and I do want to attract folks who have a similar viewpoint and align their values with that. But maybe if you could comment a moment on what happens to us when we're confronted with change in any aspects of our lives, whether it's how we respond neurologically, or, why are we so resistant to change?
Sure. Well, change is uncomfortable, right? It's the unknown, and particularly, I think that we feel discomfort when we sort of know that a change is inevitable or that it needs to occur, but we're feeling apprehensive of all the steps that we need to take to get there. So for instance, if we know we're in an unhealthy working environment or a toxic working environment, we know that we need to leave. Um, but we just don't want to go through all the steps to do that, or we're worried about the unknown. What am I going to do after this, type of thing? Then we may hesitate or delay a change out of fear. And this is true too, if we find ourselves in any kind of relationship that we know is not working for whatever reason. It's not so easy, and it's certainly not comfortable to lean in toward that discomfort and make it happen anyway. So I think that a lot of us experience discomfort when it comes to change, and that prevents many of us from actually making the changes that we know would be good and healthy. That being said, staying stuck, staying in one place, and avoiding the change at all costs, is often much more destructive. And then the change that occurs from that is not necessarily a positive one, and often some sort of change results, and it's just inevitable. It's just not necessarily the one that we are wanting, or the one that we would otherwise consciously choose. So I think it's far more important to feel like we're in the driver's seat, and that we are going after the change that we want, and not just we're not sort of helpless to whatever change happens to us.
Awesome. That's wonderful advice. So I'm just curious, and I know our listeners would love to hear and learn more about what is your why in the work that you do. What do you do that you find particularly enjoyable and rewarding?
Sure. I would say that the number one thing, or the number one reason why I do what I do, is I love to connect with others. I love to connect on a real, more meaningful level. I think that often we all get busy with our lives, and we almost live parallel lives, and we don't stop to take the time to really make eye contact, to slow down the pace, to really see one another. And I am fortunate enough to get to do that on a daily basis, and it's truly an honor, and that is why I do what I do.
Wonderful. Wonderful. So I'm curious, if you could give your younger self one piece of professional advice, what would that be?
Probably to have more confidence in myself. I am shy, and so it's easy for me to stay sort of tucked in the back corner and observe everything going on around me, than it is to actually step up and speak up. And so I think if I could speak to my younger self, I would probably say, go for it.
And have fun, right?
Yes, exactly.
Oh, this is fabulous. Well, this has been wonderful, Avery. I want to give our listeners a way to be able to connect with you directly. So if you would, what is the best way for our listeners to reach out to you?
Sure. So the best way to find me is to go to my website at Avery, Avery, Neal, N as in November, EAL, averyneal.com. And you can sign up for my email list, and it'll have updates and information on articles, courses, videos, podcasts, all of that type of thing.
Awesome. And so is there anything else that our listeners are high achieving women professionals should know about you, or anything that you do, or anything additional that you'd like to share?
I think that it's particularly important, I guess, to be kind to yourself and to have some compassion for yourself and what you're going through. It's easy, especially when we're sort of high-powered or success-driven individuals, to be particularly critical of ourselves. And so I guess what I would like to just say is that it's important to try to be a bit more kind to ourselves. And so that's important to keep in mind. And in terms of connecting with me, yeah, I shared through the website, and I'm creating new course content all the time. So if this resonates with anybody and you want to connect, I would love to hear from you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Avery Neal. We look forward to your new book. Has it just come out, or I'm sorry, the new course? Has it been just
The
been?
new course is actually going to be released next week, so I'm very
Oh,
excited. Yeah.
wow. Woohoo.
Yes, thank you.
Oh, wonderful. Well, this concludes another episode of our Makers podcast. And in the interim, for our next episode, we encourage all of our listeners everywhere to be the change that you want to see. Thank you again.
Okay, thank you so much. Take care.
Bye-bye.